Dear colleagues, my presentation will be based on the materials found in the Unitas Fratrum archive in Herrnhut, mainly fund number 4315, related to the publications in Latvian for the spiritual support of prisoners of the First World War. It will be divided in several parts. At the beginning, I shall give a quick glimpse in the research of the topic and discuss the spiritual care of the captives of war in Germany. Then I shall give a short overview of the relationship of Unitas Fratrum in Herrnhut with Latvians. A more detailed insight will be devoted to the flyers and spiritual songbook in Latvian, compiled and published by the brothers of the Unitas Fratrum. To characterize the context of those publications, a comparative aspect will be used, as the same texts were published in Estonian as well. On the research of the topic of Latvian prisoners of the First World War, unlike the refugees whose destinies have been documented and well researched, the complex and dramatic fate of the prisoners of war has been studied incomparably less. Some memoirs and several articles have been published, but more extensive research is lacking. The first Latvian prisoners of war remained in Germany as early as 1914, after Russia's unsuccessful battle in East Prussia near Masurian Lakes. And in the following years, their number continued to grow, reaching its peak in the summer of 1919, around 5,500 Latvians. They were people from different armies: the Tsarist Russian army, the Latvians taken prisoner by the Bermont-Avalov army, as well as the interned Red Army soldiers of Latvian nationality in the summer of 1920. In the second half of the 1918 and in spring of 1919, like other countries, the newly founded independent Latvia tried to return the prisoners of war home. However, Latvia's political situation was unstable and complicated, and external conditions also interfered. Thus, many individuals spent almost 7 years in various German prisoners of war camps. Latvians were characterized by their cleanness, order, and active cultural life. Many of them performed administrative duties, played in orchestras, and worked as interpreters. However, their psychological condition was severe. A heavy emotional atmosphere was created by the lack of information about the events in Latvia, about their relatives, friends, and loved ones, and the ignorance about the fate of themselves. As it appears in the memoirs of the prisoners of war, the lack of spiritual support was one of the main causes of dramatic feelings and loss of hope as well. For example, a former soldier, Valdis Tukumietis, was captured in early 1915. On the 7th of February, he writes in his diary, I quote, "Finally, we are driven across the river, beyond which is a small wooden church. The Germans go to the door of the church and heavy blows ring out in the darkness of the night. I avert my eyes. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The door swings open with a loud bang, and we are heard into the church, which is overflowing to capacity. I sit down on the floor. I am tired beyond words. My legs and arms hurt. I turn to the altar and silently pray to God. What will this first night in German captivity bring us?" And on the 8th of February, I quote, "I enter the church where there is solemn silence. During my absence, the pastor has arrived and holds the service in Polish. The pastor speaks so quietly that you can barely hear his words. It seems that he is afraid of making the slightest noise, lest the Prussians forbid us this only pleasure. I stand in the middle of the church during the whole service." about the spiritual care of prisoners of the war, World War I in Germany. The care of captives in Germany begins immediately after the start of the war. In the fall of 1914, the German Evangelical Aid Mission decides to supply prisoners of war with Christian literature. On the 27th of October of the same year, the Royal Prussian Ministry of War publishes a decree inviting garrison chaplains to undertake spiritual care if they have the necessary knowledge of the language. There are attempts to concentrate prisoners of war speaking the same language and of the same faith in one place. For example, French Protestants in Erfurt, English in Göttingen, and so on. On the 11th of December 1914, in Berlin, with the involvement of various religious organizations, including the members of the Unitas Fratrum or Moravian Church in Herrnhut, the Help Council for the Pastoral Care of the Prisoners of War is established. In 1915, a comprehensive survey takes place in order to collect data of what nationality and faith are the people there in the camps. The situation of the Baltic prisoners, or as they are called, the prisoners of war with Russian statehood of Estonian and Latvian nationality, is unenviable. The number of them is small. Moreover, they are scattered in different camps. So it is clear from the beginning one cannot find so many Latvian or Estonian language speaking pastors, and the religious literature would be the best solution for them. Unitas Fratrum undertakes this job, as the Brethren brothers from Herrnhut have continued to serve in the Baltics till the beginning of the war. They have learned Latvian and Estonian and returned to East Saxony, Germany. The main task of the Brethren Church during the war is to strengthen the unity of all Christians and provide spiritual support to everyone in need. The Moravian Church has already accumulated good experience in working with the prisoners of war during the Russo-Turkish and Anglo-Boer wars. Unitas Fratrum in Herrnhut and the Latvian and Estonian prisoners of war. Now I shall discuss more in detail the materials in the Unitas Fratrum archive concerning the Latvian and Estonian prisoners of the First World War, the so-called flyers, in German Flugblatt, or small-size periodicals, much like newspapers, and a spiritual songbook. But it should be pointed out that in the same fund, there are the same texts supplemented also by a small-size Luther's biography and a collection of religious didactic stories and songs, only in Estonian as well. The bibliography of the Latvian editions has been published by the archivist and historian in Herrnhut, Rüdiger Kröger, in the collection of Unitas Fratrum articles in 2011. But those materials are still unknown in Latvia. The research work in the archive this spring allowed me not only to study them more closely, but also to reach an agreement on their digitization. I hope later on they will be available in the digital storage of the National Library of Latvia. In the fall of 1914, Unitas Fratrum in Herrnhut, following the example of the flyers of spiritual content already published in French, authorized Brother Peter Emanuel to prepare similar editions for Estonians. Peter Book, born near St. Petersburg and educated in the centers of the Brethren in Niski and Gnadenfeld, worked as a missionary in Estonia for 7 years, learned Estonian, and shortly before the First World War returned to Herrnhut. So it is no coincidence that the first 2 flyers for the prisoners of war from the Baltic were published in Estonian already in November and December 1914. Sometime later, Brother Paul Šipang was authorized to prepare the Latvian flyers. He was born in Kleinwelk near Herrnhut, grew up and studied in the spirit of the Church of Brethren. In 1875, Schipang was sent to Vidzeme, Livland, as a diaspora worker. He was a teacher in Lindheim, learned Latvian, and later on moved to Riga. In 1904, he was elected the chief superintendent of Unitas Fratrum of the Baltic provinces of Russia and held meetings of the Brethren in Riga in Latvian and German. He was actively involved in the mission work and returned to Niski, Germany at the beginning of the World War I in December 1914. About Latvian flyers. Flyers in Latvian and Estonian were published by Gustav Winter in Herrnhut. As one can judge from this document, Latvian letters caused a slight increase in price. All the expenses were covered by the Berlin-Steglitz Aid Committee for the Spiritual Maintenance of Prisoners and Donators. They were distributed to pastors serving in the camps of captives from Russia. For example, in 1915, 775 copies of flyers in Latvian were sent to various prisoners of war camps. A letter from Pastor Küblen from Fürstenfeldbruck has survived, sent on the 1st of May 1918, and describing a great need in flyers in Latvian and Estonian in the neighbor prisoners of war camp, as there are about 12,000 Russian citizens. The initial plan was a regular issue of a flyer every 6 weeks, but it didn't materialize. 8 issues, 3 in 1915, 4 in 1916, and 1 in 1917. Perhaps the main reason for the halt was the prevailing belief among prisoners' aid organizers that books, the New Testament collections of prayers, and hymns were much more valuable and long-lasting for the needs of spiritual maintenance. But the fact that Paul Schipang in 1917 retired as he was ill and 72 years old was probably also of some importance. Due to the record of the Synod of the Evangelical Church of Kurland in 1918, Unitas Fratrum in Herrnhut was looking for letters. Several Baltic German pastors offered their help, but perhaps due to the changing political situation in Latvia in the fall of 1918, the plan was not realized. 7 of 8 issues of the flyers have been preserved. Some of them are illustrated. Some are titled Flugblatt für Kriegsgefangene. Some mention the language only, but lack date and numbering. Due to their appearance and size ranging from 3 to 10 pages, they resemble a newspaper. The texts have been translated from German, preparing parallel editions in Latvian and Estonian. This is confirmed by the preserved German manuscript of one of the issues in handwriting of Paul Schipang and several parallel issues of Latvian and Estonian flyers. Their content consists of spiritual songs, rhyming prayers, extracts from the Bible, and texts for reflection. Easy to understand religious didactic parables are also included. The flyers are interwoven with a reminder that God is a refuge and a harbor of peace. External turmoil can be overcome by maintaining inner peace and belief in God. The language is simple. Many texts are compiled as a conversation with the reader using cordial address. For example, listen, dear reader. Listen, my friend, my dear friend. The message comes to you today, not from the earth, which is now a battlefield and a bloodshed, but from heaven, where light, peace, and love alone rules. The flyers can be regarded in the context of the history of the periodicals of the Unitas Fratrum dating back to 1704 in Halle. All of them have a mutual goal to create a trans-regional spiritual church or a spiritual network, and thus to strengthen the sense of community. Almost all the periodicals deal with the explanations of biblical texts and avoid deliberately of the solution of any social and political issues. Thus, the flyers for the prisoners of war in Latvian can also mark the beginning of the periodicals of the Latvian Brethren. The first magazines will be published only in 1920s in the interwar period. The flyers translated by Paul Šipang seem old-fashioned in the context of Latvian literature at the beginning of the 20th century. His language resembles Latvian language used by Baltic German pastors during the peasant enlightenment on the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. Šipang, of course, knows the tradition of Latvian religious literature. His translations are supplemented by songs from Latvian Lutheran hymnals, perhaps several songs he may have translated himself. They differ from others as they are translated in prose without any rhythm or rhyme. To gain rhythm or to follow a definite melody, the endings of the words have been torn off. For example, nu tad es nabaks, cik slikts esmu pie pestītāja ar pieiešu. Viņš, kas uzņem ganus, uzņems ar mani. Viņš būs laipnīgs un es kā gani to pielūkšu. Well then, poor me, how bad I am, I will come to the Savior. He who welcomes the shepherds will welcome me. He will be kind to me, and I will worship him like shepherds. About the Latvian spiritual songbook. The idea of such a book belongs to Peter Book. To have a Latvian version, a Baltic German priest, at that time already retired, Wilhelm Grimm, was invited. At the beginning of the First World War, he lived already in Munich. Unlike Book and Šipang, Grimm had no direct connection with Unitas Fratrum. He was born in Riga in a family of a merchant, studied theology in Tartu, and was a pastor in Limbaži and Ikšķili Salaspils parishes. During the period of Russification of the Baltic provinces, Grimm got into trouble, lost his pastor's position, and left for Germany. The Latvian songbook looks like the Estonian prototype. It consists of 50 songs, most of which have already been published. Almost all songs can be found either in the Vidzeme Latvian Lutheran hymnals or in compiled by the member of Unitas Fratrum, Georg Heinrich Laskil, and denoted for the congregational singing of the Church of Brethren. Two songs have probably not been translated into Latvian before. One of them, Ak paņem manas rokas, Oh, take my hands, so nimden mene hende, by Julia Katarina Johanna Hausmann, born in Riga, and to be sung to the tune of Friedrich Zilher, was extremely popular among the Baltic Germans. The source of the other song, Zelts un sudrabs pasaulē pieder, gold and silver belong to the world, remains unknown. Perhaps a comparison of Latvian and Estonian texts might give some answer. Both songs are very short. The Latvian translation is poor. Probably the translator was Wilhelm Grimm himself. The hymnal as a whole resembles an anthology of classical Lutheran songs. The texts of pietists and poets associated with the Unitas Fratrum form only about 1/5 of all the songs. The spiritual songs, like the flyers, strengthen faith and hope for salvation. They address God for support. Symptomatic in this sense is already the beginning of the collection with the words, bez palīga atstājis Dievs to vēl nav kas tic, lai notiek kā viņš noliek. God has left no one who believes without a helping hand. Let it happen as he decides. As far as we know, the songbook was widely used. For example, in 1915, 2,350 copies of the book were distributed among the Latvian prisoners of war. The book was published at the expenses of the donators and Unitas Fratrum in Herrnhut. Unfortunately, it has not been possible to obtain any information about the reception of the texts and the flyers among the Latvian prisoners of the war. And finally, the conclusions. In my opinion, the publication of flyers and songbooks for prisoners of war can be considered as a logical continuation of the work of Unitas Fratrum for the benefit of Estonian and Latvian Christians. As mentioned above, Peter Book, involved in the publication of Estonian texts, and Paul Šipang, the translator of the Latvian flyers, both of them were diaspora workers of Unitas Fratrum in the Baltic. Secondly, the old-fashioned language of the Latvian texts can be regarded as a continuation of tradition as well. They reflect directly the style of Latvian religious texts compiled by the Baltic Germans. It should be pointed out that the Lutheran Church in Kurzeme and Vidzeme until 1918 was in the hands of local German pastors still. They remained the main compilers of the religious texts in Latvian and thus strengthened the old-fashioned language. And thirdly, the ecumenical orientation of the songbook corresponds to the goals declared by Unitas Fratrum already before the World War I. I quote a researcher of the history of the Brethren Church, Lutera. When the Great World Mission Conference met in Edinburgh in June 1920, there was a feeling that mission had entered a new era. Modern times were on the way to overcoming distances. Under Methodist influence, the whole world was looked upon as one great missionary field. All true Christians had to unite together to fulfill the Lord's commission. That was the point where ecumenism began. Missionary work was not the task of individual as it was in Pietism, but the task of the congregation. The church itself, but now again in a very special way, really in an ecumenical sense. The Brethren unity had never been strictly denominational. Thank you for your attention.